Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. Happy New Year from Berkeley, California. I am your co-host, Scott Parkin. And as always, I am joined by...
Happy New Year from Niles, Ohio. It's Bob Bazanko, as always. And let's optimistically hope that 2024 is better than last year. But I'd have to say it ain't looking real good right now.
Yeah, there's nothing but dark clouds on the horizon. This is our annual wrap the year.
This is our fourth year. Well,
Yep.
Fourth calendar year.
Yep.
End of fourth. Who knew?
Our anniversary will be in February for 4 years.
A couple kids with a dream.
Yep. Big dreams, big hopes, and a very dark and gloomy world that we like to make commentary on and make fun of from time to time with a little humor and humility.
By the way, people, notice what we got.
As you can tell, we now have swag, and we have more swag coming in. And so if you want a Green and Red podcast hat, it's only a $25 donation, which includes shipping costs, and we will send to you. We've already had orders coming in. And so if you want to help promote the Green and Red podcast, we'll have lots of hats on hand through 2024. And just actually real quick while we're on it, we also have a number of these certain days calendars, Freedom for Political Prisoner calendar, also a $25 donation. If you buy both a hat and a calendar, then we can put it in the same package, and that'll be that. So just email us at greenredpodcast@gmail.com, and we will get you some of our wonderful swag.
You can even send more than 25.
Or if you want to send more than 25, exactly. It's the last day of the year, and so we're doing like our last big fundraising push.
Yeah.
So the theme of today's episode is the 2023 wrap. We're going to be talking a little bit about some of those that we've lost this year, and then we're also going to be talking about those who have been fighting for the living, fighting like hell for the living, as Mother Jones said. Don't mourn, but organize. And so
pray for the dead, fight like hell for the living.
Yeah, exactly. So we're going to kick off with actually some remembrances of some folks that we've lost this year. The one that we're going to start with is someone who we actually just lost yesterday, which was John Pilger. For folks who aren't familiar, John Pilger was an Australian journalist and documentary filmmaker who covered conflicts in Vietnam, Cambodia, Bangladesh, Biafra. He also made a number of documentaries, which were celebrated around the world. His family, actually, when they announced his death yesterday, said his journalism and documentaries were celebrated around the world, but to his family, he was simply the most amazing and loved dad, granddad, and partner. Rest in peace. Pilger was known to many as what they call a campaign journalist, where he actually he would report on things, but then he would also editorialize. And in his editorials, he was actually a very sharp critic of Western foreign policy. He was also a very sharp critic of Australia's policy towards its indigenous people. In 1979, he actually made a documentary called Year Zero, The Silent Death of Cambodia, which revealed the extent of the ruling Khmer Rouge's crimes. But like I also said, he also made he wrote a book and actually made a number of films about indigenous Australians, the most known being The Secret Country, which was both a film and a book that he put out. And then also importantly, Pilger was a vocal supporter of Julian Assange and visited the WikiLeaks founder in the Ecuadorian embassy in London before Assange was thrown in prison. And then I also, on a personal note, and I think I've talked about this on the show before, actually in 2005, I was actually in jail in Australia for organizing protest actions. And it was a little bit of I was in a solitary cell, and it was a little bit of a surreal moment because I had a TV in there to turn on the late news, and there was John Pilger arguing about my case with the Attorney General of Australia. And so I have some strong, warm feelings towards John Pilger.
I want to talk about somebody and spend a bit of time on him because he's been very important, obviously, to me personally, intellectually, but also I think to the greater left. And that's Arno Mayer, somebody who if you listen to us, you've heard us bring up many times before. Arno Mayer died, I think, about 10 days ago. He had been a professor at Princeton, and really one of the more influential. I think he wasn't really generally associated with the New Left per se, people like Lefebvre and Gardner and Kolko and them. He was never really, but he actually was definitely a part of that. He was a European diplomatic historian, and he was Jewish, which is important, as we'll see in a moment. Mayer wrote two amazing books about World War I, The Political Origins of the New Diplomacy and The Politics of Diplomacy and Peacemaking, which is about the conference at Versailles. And what he did was move away from the kind of typical way people studied European politics at that time and put a huge focus on domestic politics. So he talked about labor and he talked about the origins of socialist parties throughout Europe. And the famous configuration, which I use all the time, I've used it in my writing, I've used it on here. So he devised this idea that the war during World War I and even after was a contest between what he called the forces of movement and the forces of order. Now, the forces of order would be the old regime. And he also wrote another book called The Persistence of the Old Regime, which I think is really relevant too. We'll get to that in a moment. But the forces of order would be the old regime, the people who have traditionally been in power. Now, at the time he's writing about, we're talking about kind of the landed elite of Europe. This is in the earlier period of industrialization. Clearly, there's an industrial elite, but you also have this kind of older bourgeois landed elite too. And then you have the force of movement, which is the left, right? And these are socialist parties, these are labor unions, and this is happening all over in both Europe and in the United States. And kind of one of the themes, and you get that also in The Persistence of the Old Regime, is that the forces of movement, people like us, right, often take the initiative. We kind of storm the Bastille and we attack these older entrenched forces. And they may go reeling, they may reel from it, right? But they persist, they rebound, they figure out new ways to organize society. In World War I, one of the key things they did was convince the working classes to take this kind of nationalist approach to the war from 1914 onward, rather than solidify and organize collectively as a working class against the war, right? And this is something that we've talked about ever since, right? He also, in the second book he wrote, Politics, Diplomacy of Peacemaking, which I think is really critically important, he puts the need by the West, what they saw as a need to contain the Soviet Union at the forefront of the post-war order and at Versailles. So what was going on there? Clearly Germany was a major force, right? You have to figure out what to do to Germany. But at the end of the day, they figured Germany is going to be in full. Germany is an old capitalist country, right? But the Soviet Union terrified the Western leaders, right? They had come in, the world had never seen cats like this before, right? They were nationalizing banks and shutting down the media and shutting down the churches. They had never seen anything like that. And at Versailles, you see a concentrated effort. The Bolsheviks were not even at Versailles. They were just denied entry there. They weren't even allowed to be there. And essentially, the Cold War began in that period. And that whole conception of the forces of movement, the force of order, the containment of the left. And I also think this is really prevalent in the work of somebody who's had a huge influence on me, is Gabriel Kolko, who I think writes in similar ways. And I think for that alone, Arno Mayer is legendary. I think what he's done is simply amazing. He also configures World War I and World War II as a long war, right? He connects them together, which is obviously you have to, right? Because the emergence of Hitler, the global economic depression of the 20s, and the emergence of National Socialism in Europe clearly emerges from the disastrous decisions made at Versailles. He was an unabashed leftist, a Marxist. In grad school, I actually have a field in European military history, which is funny. One of my professors there hated Arno Mayer. The conservatives hated him. Every time I mentioned a book by Arno Mayer, he would just look at me with scorn. But I think he really rocked the cradle. He rocked the boat. He actually capsized the boat. In 1988, he wrote a book called Why Did the Heavens Not Darken?, which was a historical analysis of anti-Jewish actions. And he did not use the word Holocaust. And in it, he pointed out that historically, there's a background there, which I think is important about historically how Europeans have always attacked Jews. So you have this history of pogroms and all kinds of oppressions. You have the Merchant of Venice, 1598, right? So there's this longstanding thing going on there. But the meat of it is about the World War II era. And what he did there really blew up and pissed off a lot of people. He argued that World War II really wasn't about the Holocaust, that in fact, Hitler's kind of overall program wasn't really centered on anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic ideas. In fact, he said that Hitler's main goal, and I think other left historians brought this up, was actually the Soviet Union. And that's if you read Hitler's earlier ideological works, clearly he talks about confidence. He talks about Jews, right? But he also talks about Bolsheviks a lot. They're the same to him, right? Because so much of the early Bolshevik movement was Jewish, right? And so what Arno Mayer argued, Why the Heavens Not Darken, was that once Hitler invades the Soviet Union in June of 1941 and makes quick progress, but by December, it's really badly bogged down. By 1942, the Red Army is reversing the Wehrmacht. And he argues that's really when Hitler kind of consolidated and finally articulated the full spectrum of the Holocaust. And this is when the trainings and the death camps and all that commenced, not prior to that. So the idea that World War II was about the Holocaust is clearly one of the most morally revulsive things going on in the history of the world, like Gaza today. But that wasn't the point of it. Hitler's war was against the Soviets, not the Jews. And he realized by 1942 that the war in the East wasn't turning out well. He said, and this is Arno Mayer, anti-Semitism did not play a decisive or even significant role in the growth of the Nazi movement and electorate. The appeals of Nazism were many and complex. People rallied to a syncretic creed of ultranationalism, social Darwinism, anti-Marxism, anti-Bolshevism, and anti-Semitism, as well as to a party program calling for a revision of Versailles, the repeal of reparations, the curb of industrial capitalism, and the establishment of a Volkish welfare state. That says a lot there. It was a huge, I think, contribution, an eruption really in the field of Jewish studies, in the field of Holocaust studies. I've never read anything that like Finkelstein has said about this, but I've got to believe that he's sympathetic to it, right? But it's really just an incredible book. He caught so much flack for this. I just remember the reviews going back and forth, the arguments going back and forth. He was just getting flooded with venom. If there had been social media back then, oh my God, I can only imagine he would have been trolled and threatened and
Cancel, like threatened with cancel.
Oh yeah, he's anti-Semitic, right? And then, and I think that also all the stuff he does segues, I think, very well into what we're talking about today, right? Because we've seen this configuration, the forces of movement, the force of order. Really, I think just pretty much any conflict, I think you can look at it that way, right? You have these various movements which are dealing with issues. It could be the environment, it could be labor, it could be women's rights, it could be reproductive, who knows what. But then you also have the state being involved in these kind of imperial and militaristic adventures, which often distract us and tear us apart. And we've spoken many times about how, just on a personal level, we were doing some really cool anti-globalization work, and then 9/11 happened, and then the invasion of Afghanistan, and then obviously the invasion of Iraq, and how that kind of really screwed everything up because it forced people to choose, and many people who were otherwise maybe liberal or left took a more nationalist approach to it. And we've seen that time and again. In 2008, he wrote a book called Plowshares Into Swords. It is anti-Zionist, it is pro-Palestinian. And I think, again, it gets to that point where a lot of people want to attribute particular behaviors to religion, anti-Semitism, clash of civilizations, Islamophobia, whatever it may be. And I think what Mayer's contribution, and he has many, but one of the biggest ones, is that you need to look behind that, right? The description of the Nazi appeal, I think, is really crucial because I've been saying that about Trump. A lot of people have been saying that about Trump, right? Where he said the Nazi supporters rallied to a syncretic creed of ultranationalism, social Darwinism, anti-Marxism, anti-Bolshevism, anti-Semitism, revision of Versailles, repeal of reparations, curb of industrial capitalism, and the establishment of a Volkish welfare state, right? And I think in the same way that people would attribute anti-Semitism to Hitler's motivation, in the US, liberals, I think, overwhelmingly still attribute things like racism and anti-immigrant ideas to Trump. Those exist. You'd be foolish to suggest that they don't. But there's a lot more to it than that. I think a lot of Trump supporters, much like these supporters of the Nazis, and that's a glib, I think, comparison. I'm not trying to, I think the whole kind of Trump is a fascist and Trump is a Nazi. It's very troubling historically. But I think there is a similarity in that these people really are looking for kind of a romantic past, right? And they really don't like the world, and they're pissed off at elites, like Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden and Chuck Schumer and John Fetterman and you
But
name it.
and but their theme is make America great again. So they're definitely embracing that romantic history, which didn't ever really exist, and then blame these liberal elites, mostly on the coasts,
Yeah, they're
for their state, for the
well.
current state of
I actually
affairs.
blame the liberal elites on the coast too. So got to admit, I
Yeah,
agree with you on
we're not unsympathetic.
Hakeem Jeffries and Nancy Pelosi, my Christmas card list. But there's a great article written long ago by a historian of Hold Your Hair Away called Clio Deceived. Clio is the muse of history, which talked about the way intellectuals and historians really collaborated in this effort to rehabilitate Germany after the First War, right? It wasn't our fault and we should be great again. Remember, that was what Hitler was talking about, was a greater Germany, right? It's not our fault. We should be great again. And these elites sold us out, and obviously Jewish elites was a big part of that in their ideology. But they always had a focus on the left, which is why until Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia, whatever, it doesn't matter. But until then, the West was wary of him, but never alarmed because he was acting like European imperialist act, right? No one in Europe was pro-Jewish. There had been a long history, and that's what Arno Mayer's point is, right? There's this long history of attacks on Jews, of pogroms, of repression, of discrimination. And so Hitler doesn't come up with that, and it's not new in the 1930s. And so it's a lot more complex than that. So Arno Mayer, I think today is as relevant as he's been. We'll put some stuff in the show notes. I wrote an article which kind of tees off on some of his stuff, right? But anytime something happens, I immediately in my mind think of forces of movement, forces of order. I may not be the smartest guy in the world, but I'm pretty well educated and I've learned a lot and I've been instructed by some really great people. I never knew Arno Mayer, unfortunately, but a lot of people I knew told me, read Arno Mayer. And then we talked about it. And so a good deal of my intellectual development, my maturation, and success, I think, actually, is because I'm really familiar with what he did. Politics and Diplomacy of Peacemaking, the political origins of the new diplomacy, why did the heavens not darken, the persistence of the old regime, and Plowshares Into Swords, just as a start. So that's your assignment. I want all those read by the end of January.
We'll include them in the show notes
We'll include them in the
those
show
of you
notes.
who like syllabi.
But Arno Mayer was a great one. Also, while we're at it, since we do want to pay tribute to people we lost this year. One person, of course, who we talked about at the time is Daniel Ellsberg, who we could, all I can say is rest in peace, Daniel Ellsberg, because we could spend hours talking about him. We also put out this really incredible talk he gave in Houston right before the war in 2002 or 2003. I can't remember when. That's on the in the Green and Red archives. And then somebody who died, I think in May in the spring, and I didn't know about it until I was looking at one of those people we lost this year things, is a historian named Ronald Steele. And Ronald Steele wasn't trained as an academic historian, but he, I think, became a endowed chair at USC. Little sidelight, I actually began my PhD at the University of Maryland, and Ronald Steele was a candidate there for a chair there. And I met him briefly, and I was all excited because I was going to work with Ronald Steele. But he wrote the definitive biography of Walter Lippmann in the American Century, The Temptations of a Superpower, a bunch of other really good stuff. Check that out if you can. Ronald Steele, Daniel Ellsberg, Arno Mayer, and there are many more, but that's
Pilger.
John Pilger, right? And there are a few others. There's some other people we lost this year too who are more in the celebrity group, but I think they're also important because they also, I think, had political and cultural meaning. Obviously, I don't know, the two, I think it's hard to say most important, but the two that really, I think, stood out this year were Harry Belafonte and Norman Lear, who are giants in any way, right? They're giants in the world of culture, in the world of celebrity, in the world of the arts and politics as well. Harry Belafonte was involved in every major civil rights campaign of the entire 20th century, all the way through apartheid and into the 21st century. Norman Lear, what can you say about him? We should probably do a whole show on Norman Lear as well. I don't know. He changed. It's amazing. After he died, I went back and I just looked at some old clips from All in the Family, and it is amazing. The 1970s, I think, is going to go down as the heyday of American liberatory culture. Of
Yeah.
the stuff that Lear especially did in
The,
that era was just
the,
stunning.
the All in the Family is this sort of landmark
It
show,
is. Oh
which
yeah.
really it's based on a British show from a couple years before, but it's this sort of landmark show about the American white working class and their views of how and their views amidst the tumultuous 60s and 70s, but also the spin-off shows that
Yeah.
Lear created from All in the Family, the Jeffersons, which were about upwardly mobile blacks, and Maud, which was about liberal women. It's just like he was a giant in
Good
yeah,
times, a
in
working
good
class black
times.
family.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
think you
exactly.
any? I don't know. I don't think there are any shows about working class black families on TV anymore, are there?
No,
I don't know. I don't really watch
no.
much TV, but I don't think so.
I actually feel
No,
like the 80s was actually a bit of a reaction to Norman Lear, some of the shows that we saw in the 1980s, which is something we could talk about in the future, like The Cosby Show and Family Ties, which
yeah,
is
yeah, yeah. Going back to that more comfortable era. And look at the stuff Lear touched on, right? Homosexuality, sexual harassment, rape, gay homosexuality, mixed marriages, right?
Mhm,
Interracial
mhm.
marriages, abortion and Maud. There's a great episode where Archie and Edith go to an engagement party for Lionel, who is the Jefferson's son. And they don't know that Lionel's fiance's parents is a black and white couple. And Archie
Tom Willis.
Jefferson drops an N bomb, and Archie Bunker says, "Geez, I ain't said that word myself in 3 years." But at the end, it gets really melancholy, and Jefferson and Bunker toast each other, and they say, "Here's the old days. Here's the old times." It's an incredible show. He was an incredible guy. So
Yeah.
rest in peace, Norman Lear. From another actor who one of my favorites was Alan Arkin, who was in, we did a show some time ago on the best political movies, and Alan Arkin had two in the top list, which were Catch 22, where he played Yossarian, and then one of my favorites ever, The Russians Are Coming, which isn't inherently political. It's really quite funny. Jonathan Winters and Carl Reiner, but Arkin is brilliant in that. It's about this Russian sub that grounds ashore, and was it Maine, I think. Eva Marie saying, great
Or
movie.
Nantucket, maybe.
Yeah. And was it Alan Arkin's father, I think? I don't know, I could be wrong. But that song, I think Three Dog Night had a hit with it. The world is black, the world is white. Together we learn. Alan Arkin's father wrote that song like back in the 30s.
But also weren't his parents actually organizers in New York, working
Yeah.
with like labor movements and socialist movements, which Arkin moved away from as an adult, but still he's very rooted in
Yeah.
families of labor and labor radicals
Yeah.
and organizers, etc.
His son was also I think one of the creators of The Americans, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah,
Adam Arkin.
his son, you actually see his son and actually gets a lot of headline or gets a lot of credits because he directs actually a lot of
Well, that's what I
television
mean.
now.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But I think he was there on the ground floor of The Americans, which I think is a great show anyway.
yeah, yeah.
And then musically, there are a ton. I just have a few here you can add to it. Sinead O'Connor, who really, as much as anybody, ripped a band-aid and caught total hell, like really fucking caught amazing hell for it on the Vatican sexual abuse. I remember on Saturday Night Live, she ripped up a picture of the Pope. And I tell you, one of the saddest things I ever saw, not long after that, Columbia had a 30th anniversary of Bob Dylan's first album. And Dylan, the counterculture, right, who represented the 60s more than Dylan, civil rights, anti-war movement, protest, you name it. And Sinead O'Connor walks out at a Bob Dylan show and is booed by Bob Dylan fans. I was crushed. Like the 60s is over for sure. And and I'm sure that contributed a lot to it. She had a really difficult life. And rest in peace, rest in power, Sinead O'Connor. Tony Bennett, what can I say about that? I get kind of weepy thinking about Tony Bennett. I grew up in an Italian family, and we listened to a lot of Tony Bennett, probably more than Sinatra, actually. My mother loved Tony Bennett, who was also very active politically. I was very active in the civil rights movement, anti-war activist. I think he'd been in World War II. I don't remember what his service was. And I remember in 2011, on the 10th anniversary of 9/11, Tony Bennett caught hell because he said, "Hey, we know why this happened." It's like, this shouldn't surprise you. The U.S. does this. The U.S. brought it on itself, right? Rest in peace, Tony Bennett. And then the last one I want to think about, and there was so many more. Actually, it's not the last one because there's somebody who just died a few days ago. is David Crosby
Mhm.
from Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, who I think if you were going anytime you see, have you ever seen a documentary about the 60s that didn't have CSN, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young music in it? It's just always there, right? And then just a few days ago, Tommy Smothers died. And I don't know, Smothers, I always thought he was underappreciated. Maybe not. He and his brother were a folk singing comedy act. He was also a yo expert. And but they had a show that pushed the boundaries and got in trouble, all the time. They took on LBJ. Eventually, I think they were canceled because of their politics. In 19, I think 67, they were reprimanded. They were going to have Pete Seeger on, who was going to sing a song called Waist Deep in the Big Muddy. It's an anti-war
Mhm.
song. Waist Deep in the Big Muddy, and the Big Fool said to move on. And CBS wouldn't let him. So they just said, we're not going to do a show. I think they had Seeger on about a year later. So Tommy Smothers was a really important political figure. Plus, he produced one of, I think, the greatest politicians of the 20th century, and Pat Paulson,
Mhm.
who was Pat Paulson was one of the cast members on the show. Really droll, goofy looking guy who decided to run for president in 1968. I think what was his slogan was something like a troubled man for troubled times or something like that. Tommy
Yeah.
Smothers was another great one. So
There's actually a couple of musicians now that you said it, I want to just throw out.
yeah,
One we actually did a tribute to on the show a couple of weeks ago, which was Shane MacGowan
Kate
from
McGowan.
Pogues. Sang a lot about, had a lot of Irish Republican politics and anarchist politics and left of center politics.
I think he did stuff with Sinead O'Connor too, didn't he?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Robbie Robertson from the band actually
Oh
passed
yeah.
away.
Yep.
He was a giant.
Yeah.
And then Jimmy Buffett also passed away this year, who less what people know, Jimmy Buffett's known for his sort of folksy country rock sort of songs like Margaritaville and things like that. What people know less about Jimmy Buffett is he was actually an ardent environmentalist, particularly around conservation issues around the Everglades in Florida, where he was from. There's actually a great film that came out in like maybe the mid 2000s called Hoot, which is based on a young adult novel, which is about a bunch of kids who actually fight to save a burrowing owl in the Florida Everglades from the fast food development. Jimmy Buffett actually produced it and actually had a role in it. So also, I just love talking about Jimmy Buffett too. So there you go.
He played on the No Nukes tour, right? And a big advocate of marijuana legalization.
Yeah, exactly. We need more about
Yeah.
And then I think that's it for our celebrity and musician list. And then so I was going to move into, I'm going to talk actually about some activists that we lost, actually land defenders. First thing I want to say is that every year, when we talk about this on the show pretty frequently, is dozens, if not dozens, hundreds of land defenders all over the world are lost, mostly murdered, tortured, assassinated, what have you, by forces connected to industry. We also, about a month ago, had Brandon Lee on our show. He's Chinese American, but he had been living in the Philippines working with land defenders and indigenous communities and was left a quadriplegic after an assassination attempt by the Philippine military. But then the other land defender that I want to lift up, which is actually the first land defender environmental activist that was murdered in the US, which was Manuel Paez Terán, or also known as Tortuguita. Tortuguita was a 26-year-old environmental activist, anarchist, and forest defender in the Weelaunee forest in Atlanta. Tortuguita was assassinated by the Georgia State Police, and they've had this really shitty cover-up trying to say that he had actually pulled a gun and fired on like a Georgia State SWAT team, and then they just shot him dozens of times. And it's led to a huge response from environmentalists, anarchists, the movement throughout the US. We've seen banks, insurance companies, construction companies, politicians in Atlanta and Georgia and DC all targeted with protest and direct action. It's also led to an increasing escalation on the part of the state of Georgia and the city of Atlanta. Over 61 people have been charged with RICO, criminal RICO charges, and then dozens, I actually don't know what the most current number is, have been charged with domestic terrorism by the state of Georgia.
And this is for stuff like passing out leaflets and attending a concert and getting mud on your shoes and
or doing a tree set, right?
Doing a tree set, right? Yeah,
Right.
It's scary shit. And didn't Pilger do a lot of stuff on Georgia? I think more in the elections in Georgia. But I believe Pilger spent a lot of time talking about Georgia, doing stuff on Georgia politics.
I didn't know that.
I think he did stuff because George has been in this voter suppression thing for quite some time.
Yeah, and that's been a story for a long time.
Yeah. But I think it's all connected. Also, with regard to Tortuguita, there was an election. Now, was it in just Atlanta or was it in the whole state to stop construction? And it won. And the city fathers, mostly who are African American Democrats, just ignored it, right?
I believe it was just the city of Atlanta, or it might have been Fulton County.
Maybe in
But
Fulton County, but
yeah,
they just ignored it. It just
they actually fought the ballot, and it was a ballot initiative. They actually fought it in court, and they may have actually been able to at least put a pause on it, because I actually don't think they voted.
Oh, I thought they did. Oh, okay.
Oh,
maybe I just read it. It's ahead in the. Maybe I just read like a poll where it was way ahead or something. But
yeah.
Clearly they understand that people don't want this.
And they knew they were going to lose too. So,
yeah, that's what I mean.
Right. And it was, and the ballot initiative was around the city of Atlanta giving money to build this cop training facility, i.e., Cop City.
Yeah, haven't Israeli security consultants been part of that too?
Yeah, and I believe they've modeled it on some Israeli training center, if I'm not mistaken. Shocking. I know, shocking. So the last thing that we want to close on is we've talked a lot about praying for the dead. We've remembered those that we've lost. But the other thing we want to talk about is actually we've seen a lot of movement, an upsurge of movement activity. It feels like it's just been increasing probably over the last 10 or 15 years. But we've seen a huge upsurge in movements in the US. And that's mostly what we talk about here on Green and Red, although we have covered some international stuff as well. But we've covered a lot on movements and protest movements and direct action on issues around climate and fossil fuels, Gaza, labor, just to name a few episodes. We just recorded an interview with Tina Gearhart on COP28, which we see the impact of how people movements have actually been pushing on climate and climate justice for quite some time. We just did an interview with Josh Davidson around political prisoners, which is about people who have been involved in movement struggle and gone to actual prison for it, including our friends Jake Conroy and Daniel McGowan. We did a number of shows around the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation and the movement to stop to basically monkey wrench trade agreements and things like that. I was actually involved in a lot of APEC organizing. We've had people from the Mountain Valley Pipeline struggle on. We had a lot of people on talking about Cop City. We actually did a fantastic interview this year with filmmakers and a union organizer on the LA teacher strike. And then we've done everything from we talked to lots of climate activists. We've talked to anti-fascists in Texas. We've talked with people with the Emergency Committee for Rehoboth. So it's just like a sort of important part of what this podcast is, uplifting these movement struggles. Other podcasts, particularly the more popular supposed so-called left-leaning socialist podcasts, don't talk to movement people as much, but we pride ourselves on how we talk with movement people, particularly those fighting things like fossil fuels and nuclear power and actual fascists and a lot of labor stuff as well. And we've also talked a lot about state repression, and that's also a big theme on our show. So we've talked about state repression in Atlanta. That was some of our Cop City shows. We always are talking with Jake Conroy about Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty, and Shaq, who Jake actually went to prison for almost 4 years. But state repression against movements is actually a big theme on our show. You look like you were going to say something.
No, I was actually looking something up I can't find, but we talked to Daniel Goldhagen, who is the director of How to Blow Up a Pipeline. We usually will have to do that. We're late, put out our kind of not our favorite episodes of the year, but that was a lot of fun talking to Daniel Goldhagen. And we got a lot of good stuff planned for the coming year too.
And Trevor Aronson, actually, who did a podcast expose on undercover FBI operatives in the Denver Black Lives Matter movement.
But I made a new friend this year who I think will become a more regular guest. That's Rodrigo Acuna, a specialist on Latin American issues in Australia. Been chatting with him. He feels the same way I do about JFK's foreign policy. We will return to that. That's become one of our bread and butter issues, right? Mm-hmm. Even though we are condescending and insulting, according to people who have Oliver Stone and half of Hollywood on their side. But they're like Israel, right? They blame us. They attack us. They're the victims, right? It's freaking hilarious, right?
I'm sure that's where they got their public relations strategy.
Yeah. We have some great interviews planned. We will be talking to Bev Stoll. If you don't know who that is, make sure you check it out. She was Noam Chomsky's longtime assistant who's written a memoir about her time with Noam. So we're really looking forward to that.
And we have a couple, we have some future episodes connecting the labor struggles to climate. We'll be talking to Jeremy Brecher, who is the author of a classic book called Strike, but it also works with the Labor Network for Sustainability. And I actually, a friend of ours who's actually been on the show before, Jeff Ordauer, actually just edited a book connecting labor and climate issues as well.
I did not know that.
Which we'll be hopefully talking to. It's an anthology, so hopefully we'll be talking to some of the authors as well as Jeff about it. So that'll all be coming up in 2024. And we're the Green and Red podcast. We're a bit scrappy. We also sometimes like to name names. We sometimes like to make fun of other people who we scratch our heads about some of where some of their politics are around. And then another issue that we have done a couple of our Scrappy Sundays on, and then we also interviewed Joshua Frank about, and then actually a number of the climate justice people we talked to actually have pretty strong feelings about this as well, which is around nuclear energy. And at least a faction within that sort of left socialist media sphere, which is very pro-nuke and fanatical about it. And these are folks like that you will find on Left Reckoning, and they write in Jacobin as well, which is they claim to be part of a movement fighting for justice and liberation and socialism and things like that. But they also seem to support at least like an energy solution to climate change that continues to put some of the poorest, most oppressed communities in the world, not in just the US, into these sacrifice zones. And so when we talk about things like nuclear waste and we talk about things like uranium extraction and have back and forths with some of these so-called socialists, it's a little disturbing to actually see how fanatical they are promoting one of actually the most brutal, evil corporate sectors in recent history. Like we've done shows with Josh, and we've talked about it ourselves about just how many people on the Dene Reservation, for example, suffered as a result of uranium extraction. We also you also see that level of pollution and exploitation in First Nations communities in Canada and in Aborigine communities in Australia. And it's a very disturbing thing. And when you try to have a back and forth with them about it, they basically say that you're pro fossil fuels, which also is a big head scratcher, being that I basically built my career on campaigning and organizing against fossil fuels for over 20 years. And so where I fall with fossil fuels and where I fall with nuclear energy is I fall on the side of communities and people who are in struggle against not just what happens after climate change happens, but also with people who are on the receiving end of extraction and combustion and infrastructure, et cetera. I just want to put that out there.
I mean, you would think that any industry that produced Chernobyl and Fukushima just by itself, that's enough, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And they also defend air conditioning, private planes. It comes from this kind of very old, kind of almost Bolshevik idea about the need for industrialization, electrification, which in 1917 made a lot of sense, right? Not 1917 anymore, and the world is falling apart, right? And
they also along these same lines defend carbon capture and storage. If it's state run, carbon capture is okay.
Yeah. You know how I joke that the JFK people make themselves the victims, even though they have all the power. And these guys do the same thing. They attack us, right? When they control left media, and the New York Times, everyone, oh, Jacob, they've set themselves up as the voice of the left, right? And we're just like this scrappy little podcast, and we have this great group of supporters, but we don't have that kind of Brooklyn cachet and that kind of Brooklyn money.
We're like the cattle dogs nipping at the heels is what we are.
Yeah, we are. We're that pesky little dog that won't
The
let
mosquito
go.
in the tent, the mosquito in the tent, maybe.
Yeah. Anyway, and by the way, if you guys want, come on. We're not afraid to talk to anybody. It's just
we had Jefferson Morley on this year, so
I'm not going to offer you $100 like I do for Oliver Stone. I may even ramp it up this year. Oliver Stone, how about $200 cash money, so you don't have to declare it on your taxes?
Yeah.
Come on, Oliver Stone, come on and talk to me about JFK. All right. But yeah, it's been a good ride. Honestly, I don't know, like the last 4 years have been rough. And this has been like just on a personal level, pretty therapeutic for me. It's a bad world out there. It's very bleak. And at least a couple times a week, you and I could come on and do this.
And I would not be, I know we're finishing. I would not be remiss. I would be remiss if before we go, the elephant in the room right now is we want to obviously extend all our most passionate hope for a better life to the people of Palestine, of Gaza in particular, right? There's nothing we can say. I think the most important thing out there is just to keep talking about it. Don't let it subside. I think the ruling class really relies, they count on issues dying down or people getting distracted. And we haven't seen that. In fact, I think we've seen a global movement that's the biggest in a long time over any issue. It's like no nukes or the Vietnam War. It's huge. And outside of the United States, there's significant support, but we have to do more than that. Obviously, Joe Biden doesn't give a shit. He's just issued an executive order to send more weapons to Israel. He can't issue an executive order for anything in the United States. My hands are tied. It's up to the courts. It's up to Congress. But when it comes to funneling money to the biggest terrorist, most aggressive, atrocious state in the world, the tap never gets shut off. So keep talking about Gaza. And Biden is clearly willing. He's basically made it clear, right? He doesn't care if he wins or loses re-election. Israel is more important to him than, all I fucking hear from all these liberals is how horrible Trump is. He's the worst thing ever. And yet they are cramming Biden down your throat, right? Biden, Trump is a fascist. Trump is this. Trump is that. Oh, but they shouldn't take him off the ballot in Colorado. That's not fair. Or all this bullshit. Biden is basically thrown a huge middle finger to people who supported him in 2020. He, at this point, I don't see how he's going to win. The Democratic Party is walking into the abyss and they don't give a shit. And when it's over, they're going to blame the Greens and they're going to blame Cornel West and they're going to blame RFK and Marianne Williamson. And RFK is a lunatic, but they are going to blame everybody but themselves. And Hillary and Obama and Biden will sit around on some fucking yacht with David Geffen somewhere, sipping pina coladas and laughing at clowns like us who are out there dealing with fucking Trump every fucking day.
Yeah.
So great. I don't have to worry about how many F-bombs I drop.
Yeah, we're not censored. We're not censored here.
Yeah.
I think that's our wrap for 2023. I do want to throw out some thanks to a couple of people who helped make this podcast happen that you don't see. We have our music director, which is Moody. When you hear Green and Red Blues, that is Moody.
He's our Bubba Desi.
Yep, exactly. Exactly. I want to throw a thanks out to Isaac, who is one of our editors, who does an amazing job with our audio podcasts. I want to throw a thanks out to Tobin, who designs our stuff and turns around stuff pretty quickly for us, actually, when we really need it. This lovely design on this hat is from Tobin. And then I want to throw a big thanks out to our executive producer, Hep Ingham, who continues to rock it. I want to throw a thanks out to all of our patrons who support us thick and thin and all the new patrons that we get. And then also want to throw a big thanks out to our audience and all of you listeners and people who watch us on YouTube. Then I want to throw a big thanks out to Bob for helping make this happen.
Thank you too. Yeah. Now we as Hillary would say, it takes a village. But yeah, all those people are really great. Hap has supported us financially, but he's also actually been really cool in helping us get guests on and giving us feedback and stuff like that, which we really enjoy. And so we're heading on to our we just finished our fourth calendar year. We're heading on to our fourth year of podcasting, which is really amazing. What is it like? Something like less than 1 or 2% actually make it a year.
Yeah.
And so we've survived. We're never going to be Ben Shapiro, but
no Joe Rogans here, but
would you want to be? Yeah, it'd be nice to have their following, but and Ben Shapiro, that's a tortured guy there, man.
Exactly.
I can see the way he's going to die. It's going to be like a David Carradine kind of thing. They're going to find him in the closet playing some kinky sex game with a tie around his neck or something. Yeah. We love you all. At the risk of sounding ridiculous, a true revolutionary is guided by great feelings of love. And in fact, today is my math ain't great. So what's 48 and 20, 60 something anniversary of the successful Cuban Revolution. Fidel and Che marched into Havana today, one of the great events of the 20th century, one of the most important events of the 20th century. Have a pina colada tonight in honor of the struggle. Get some rest, enjoy yourself, try to breathe, and pray for the dead and fight like hell for everybody else.
Yep. And if you like what you're hearing, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram.
And if you want a hat.
Yeah, if you want a hat or if you want a calendar, hit us up at greenredpodcast@gmail.com and check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Hit subscribe on YouTube. Give us a rate and review on the audio platforms, particularly Apple. And if you really like us, check us out at patreon.com/greenredpodcast or make a one-time donation by hitting the support button at greenredpodcast.org. And we'll see everybody again in 2024. So just go make some trouble and misbehave.
Something everybody everywhere does in the same